Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to the start of our 18th annual Adam Smith Week. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Peter Kelcan. I'm professor of economics here at the College of Charleston, and I'm the director of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process. As our dean, Paul Schwager, likes to point out, Adam Smith Week is a signature event in the School of Business here at the College of Charleston, and I couldn't be more proud of what we've put together for this week. The Center's mission is to advance the understanding of the economic and political and moral foundations of a free society. The Center runs several student-focused programs. We have reading groups, seminar series, right, research, and mentoring. Right? Our programs then help to support students and faculty in the research that they do in the support of our mission. This year is a special year. It is the 250th anniversary of the Wealth of Nations. And so we have set up a star-studded group of speakers for you this week. So I encourage you to come to all of our events. There are calendars up there for you to find more information about the remaining events this week. There is a host of information, if you will, that you'll see behind me with additional details. There's a couple of things here that I want to point out. You'll see the table tents with the QR codes. Please click on those. Those will fill out surveys about the speaker, right? That's also where we get you to sign in terms of attendance. So if you've been persuaded to be here, right, by one of your faculty members, we'll get that name to them. The second, you'll see a green QR code. That's for one of our donors, so we would appreciate it if you would scan that and register there to let people know that you were here for this event. As I mentioned, the Wealth of Nations was written 250 years ago, and people ask me if this is still relevant today. And the fact that we are dealing with issues of protectionism, worrying about trade balances, that we are talking about trade as if it is a zero-sum game. These were the same issues that Adam Smith was concerned with in 1776. So at this point, I would like to turn it over to one of our market process scholars, Parker Palmer, to introduce Dr. Peter Boettke.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Adam Smith Week here at the College of Charleston. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Boettke, a distinguished university professor of economics and philosophy at George Mason University and director of the F.A. Hayek program at the Mercatus Center. Dr. Boettke is one of the leading scholars in modern political economy, drawing on intellectual traditions of thinkers like Adam Smith, F.A. Hayek, James Buchanan, and Elinor Ostrom. His work focuses on how institutions and market processes shape human behavior, economic development, and the possibilities of freedom and prosperity. He is the author of numerous books and articles, including influential work on the collapse of socialism and the role of institutions in economic life. His most recent book, The Historical Path to Liberty and Human Progress, co-authored by Rosalino Candela, brings together a series of essays exploring how institutions shape economic development, human progress, and the evolution of liberal market societies. He also has held leadership positions in major academic organizations such as the Mont Pelerin Society and Southern Economic Association. Beyond his scholarship, Dr. Boettke is also an incredibly dedicated teacher, known for inspiring students to think critically about the economic ways of thinking and its relevance to the world around us. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Boettke.
I think I did this technology right, but you never know. Thank you very much, Peter, for that introduction, as well as to you, Parker. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here at your beautiful college and also to be able to talk to you about Adam Smith on this great occasion of the 250th anniversary of the Wealth of Nations. There's also, a whole cottage industry that's going on right now because we're also celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And so the interaction of those two books, because over the next several decades after the publication of The Wealth of Nations, he was very influential on the founders. For example, Hamilton had a long exchange with him about things, and Thomas Jefferson, when he started the University of Virginia, the textbook that they adopted for the University of Virginia was a Smithian textbook. By the way, it was a French version of popularizing Smith, which makes sense given Jefferson's concern with that. But Smithian ideas have had a huge influence on the play of ordinary life from the time it was published. The book had such a big appeal, in fact, that Argentina in 1850s adopted their constitution grounded in Smithian economics. And from the period of the 1850s until the 1930s, Argentina had risen to be one of the wealthiest places in the world. And then in the 1930s, they crashed. And the timing of that is when they decided to move drastically away from the Smithian part. Now, as you go through the book of The Wealth of Nations, this part of the book is in the fifth book of The Wealth of Nations. That's where he's laying out the implications for public policy of his position. But it builds up from the very beginning, and he starts to a magnificent work because he starts with the very basic human propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. And then what he does is he builds the argument up all the way through of where it is that we basically engage in trading behavior with one another rather than rating behavior with one another. And I'm going to show you guys the hockey stick that I'm sure many of you have seen in life. And for most of human existence, we actually lived in miserable poverty. It's only a blip in history that we've actually experienced wealth. And the reason is my conjecture is going to be, and it's following Smith, is that period of time when we were stuck on the low growth equilibrium, that was when we dominated our interactions with one another through violence, through rating rather than trading. It was zero-sumness. Okay? What happened was something unique, which was we started to see the world in positive sum terms. What all constituted that has been puzzling thinkers for centuries now, because it's an inflection point, right? Boop! And it's right here that your attention is drawn to. What happened? Why were we here in this? Now, what's fascinating in the story that I'm telling you, Professor Calcagno started with asking about the relevance. There's just a brand new study published in the American Economic Review by Nathan Nunn. And it's the rise in your generation of zero-sum thinking. Right? They document it. Your generation thinks in terms of zero-sum, not in terms of positive sum. Now, why would that be? That's a whole other big sociological, psychological, and other kind of question. Political question, by the way, maybe. Precisely because maybe we've turned the world into a zero-sum game. But Donald Trump is a classic example of a zero-sum thinker. And it's not when he became president. You can go all the way back to when he was a businessman and had no possibility he was ever going to be involved in politics. And he was your quintessential mercantilist even then. He thought when Japan was doing really well, he thought Japan was doing really well because they were stealing our dollars and just giving us things. Okay? You can actually find quotes of him saying that. They're ripping us, just the same way you always hear it right now, right? They're ripping us off. They're taking advantage of us. They send us these goods, and we have to give them our money. One of the core things about mercantilism was the belief that wealth was about the accumulation of money, not the increase in the value that's been created by the economy, all right, through trade and mutually beneficial exchanges. And so, before I get started on this, I want to just point out, we have Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations up there. How awesome is that you get to see think about that. That's a book published in 1776. And it's sitting there in front of you. Like, how many things in your life have you ever seen that were from 1776? Well, you're in Charleston, so there might be a ton, right? But still, it's pretty cool, right? You're sitting there, working through it. When that book was published, Smith had a fan mail from somebody, and he's writing about his book, and he describes it in the book as my aggressive assault on all of British commercial life. And a lot of people read that today and they go, oh, was Smith like a lefty kind of thing or whatever? No, it's because all of British commercial life at the time he was writing was mercantilist. Right? East India Company. You can think about all the different monopolies that were created by the British Empire, how they dealt with everyone. It was imperialism, colonialism, all these things that Smith is against. And Smith is against them in order to defend a free economy, a free society. So of course his book is an aggressive assault on all of British commercial life, because British commercial life was a rent-seeking society. Right? So, Peter worked at Auburn with one of the greatest economists. He's passed away now, of the latter part of the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, Bob Eklund. Bob Eklund has a fantastic book with Bob Tullison called Mercantilism as a Rent-Seeking Society. For those of you who are interested in public choice questions, one of the things that we constantly ask ourselves is, has the United States become more a rent-seeking society in the 21st century or less? All right? Now, here, I'm from Washington, D.C. I'm here to tell you, ever since 9/11, 8 of the 10 wealthiest counties in America are now located in Washington, D.C. We do not produce anything in Washington, D.C. We just simply take things. Okay? So 8 of the 10. One of the great things about the United States, and you can look around this in the world, is that the wealthy countries in the world, their capital cities are not their wealthiest cities. Other cities tend to be what drives things. So it's a second city or a third city. So think about what in the United States, when you think about wealth creation, what was it traditionally? What would you think about? New York, Chicago, LA, more recently San Francisco. Not Washington, D.C., right? The great economist Andre Schleifer, he wrote a fantastic paper related to this, in which what he does is he looks at the relationship between whether or not a society has more engineers or more lawyers. And he postulated the societies that have more lawyers are the ones that are the rent-seeking societies, and the ones that have the more engineers are in fact the more productive societies. And then he asked the question, for very young people, what is the rules under the game that you're playing that in a society you would choose with your high human capital capacity to become a lawyer or become an engineer? And it's precisely because of the rents that you would end up by going into lawyering. Or the profits, if they were a more profit-based society, that you would go into engineering and be building. All right, a little bit of a detour to get started on this. But this guy and this book is well worth your time of studying. It's wrestling with the most profound question that we have in the social sciences. Why are some nations rich and other nations poor? How is it that nations that were poor became rich? And how is it that nations were rich became poor? All right, New Zealand was at one time the poorest country in the OECD. After their pro-market reforms, they became one of the richest. Now they flatlined back down again. Okay? If you go back in human history and you look at various different countries over time, you will end up by seeing that some of them were like very, very wealthy and then crashed, and some of them were really poor and rose. The consequences of that rise is what saves billions of lives from the Malthusian trap. This is what I meant by the violence. This is governed by the Malthusian trap here. Then you get here, the Malthusian trap, you have the Great Escape. Adam Smith was at the beginning of that, and the title of his book is key. It's not The Wealth of Nations. That's our lazy professor shorthand. It's an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. I'll try to explain a little bit more about that. All right, just this guy, Adam Smith. Adam Smith, by the way, gives, I think, the fundamental way to think like an economist. right from the beginning. Now, here's what I'm going to try to do. It's related to professors, by the way. So you want to understand what we economists do. What we're going to do is we're going to have a formula. You say preferences, institutions, outcomes. Preferences, institutions, outcomes. We tend not to like preference-based explanations. I like coffee because I like coffee, or I drink coffee because I like coffee. It doesn't tell me anything. All right? It might be true, but it doesn't tell me anything. Here's what would be cool, right? If the relative price of coffee shifted with regard to tea, and I ended up by drinking more tea rather than coffee, even though I prefer coffee over tea, now I have some explanations about what's going on with my demand curve and relative prices and all that stuff like that. So everyone with me? We're going to freeze people. Okay, people are people. We're going to explain the variation in outcome, the rise of wealth and poverty of nations, by what? Variation in the institutions. Smith gives this wonderful example in his book about professors in Oxford and professors in Glasgow. He's from Glasgow, but he ended up by going to school in Oxford. Okay, but then he came back and was taught in Glasgow. Here's what he observed. The professors in Oxford had long given up the pretense of even teaching. The professors in Glasgow were enthusiastic and very dedicated to their students. Both were homo professornomicus. It's not like it was just good professors in Glasgow, bad professors. They're both homo economicus. This is department chairmen know this, deans know this, right? We have homo professornomicus, but what happens is the way the pay structure was. In Oxford, they were paid out of an endowment regardless of whether or not the students attended their class. In Glasgow, they only got paid by student fees. So homo professornomicus reacts differently to the cost-benefit calculation because of the institutions. So, again, Steve, preferences, put a bar over that. Institutions, outcomes, going to explain the variation in the outcome by the variation in the institutions. Let me just point out something. There are things like natural characteristics, like it's not shocking to you to see Shaquille O'Neal jump center in the NBA and Willie Shoemaker ride horses in the Kentucky Derby. It would be really, really bizarre to see Willie Shoemaker jump center in the NBA and Shaquille O'Neal ride horses at that. So it does matter, characteristics, but you don't need a theory to explain that. Good people do good things, bad people do bad things. Okay, I just gave you a description, right? Tall people play in the NBA, short people ride horses, right? That's a description. I'm not actually explaining anything really there. What I'm trying to do is explain like how it is that individuals, as they are going to engage in various different patterns of behavior that vary based on the incentive structures that they face. Adam Smith already has that in The Wealth of Nations. And that is a core idea of economics. We have in the audience here today one of the best principles teachers of economics ever, and that is Russ Sobel. For years, he's a Ken Elsinger Award winner and also responsible for a tremendous amount of people that decide to study economics. And from what I understand, what everyone's told me, Russ, is that in your classes, the fundamental thing about the economic way of thinking was you taught that consistently and persistently all the way through about the trade-offs that we face, right? So this is what Adam Smith is asking us to do. We improved since that time, but that's a key thing. So Glasgow and Oxford, left Oxford in disillusionment, as you might imagine. He's a professor of moral philosophy. He publishes his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and it establishes him as a leading thinker in the Scottish Enlightenment. He constantly revised the theory of moral sentiments, constantly. And in those notebooks of his revisions is what became The Wealth of Nations. So there's a wrong view in history that there's a split between Adam Smith, the moral philosopher, and Adam Smith, the political economist. It's called, get ready, it's not that creative. It's called Das Adam Smith Problem. Right? The Germans were not exactly like all that interesting, so that's what they came up with. Das Adam Smith Problem. But this is a mistake. It's not actually because the one is built on the other. But Smith, wrote tons of things. He just, as I'm going to say here in a second, he burned everything on his death except for The Wealth of Nations and the Theory of Moral Sentiments. And so we don't really know what Smith's books on jurisprudence, on astronomy, all those things, they're based on the lecture notes of his students. And so what I want you all to contemplate, both the professors here and the students, imagine that Professor Calcagno's future book is based on the notes that you were taking in class. How much are we going to see a one-to-one thing there, right? So Parker, it's all your notes, and eventually you come out and it's like the Calcagno thesis, right? You know. So this is Smith's fate. All right. He burned us 16 volumes. But here's the key question. This is from an article by Kenneth Boulding, the great Kenneth Boulding, second John Bates Clark Medal winner. What Boulding wrote is an article called After Samuelson, Who Needs Smith? And his argument is we all do, because Smith is still speaking to us today. So Professor Calcagno's remark, my remark about the zero-sumness, it shows that there's ideas in Adam Smith that aren't completely absorbed in the way we talk about the current conversation that Smith can help still inform. And this is what Boulding was trying to tell his audience as well. And that one thing is a fundamental question. The Nobel Prize winner in 2024 won for asking the question, why are some nations rich and other nations poor? The Nobel Prize winners in 2025 won for asking the question, why are some nations rich and other nations poor? We're still puzzling with this question. All right? In 2024, their answer was institutions. In 2025, it was entrepreneurship. Now, you, smart guys, figure out how to interact those two, institutions and entrepreneurship. All right. So why is this puzzle, right? Remember this. Okay, so your mind here. That's the natural condition. Poverty is what needs no explanation. Wealth is the thing that needs explanation, because poverty is our natural condition. So that's why it's an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. All right? Because our natural state is one of, as Hobbes put it, nasty, brutish, and short. How many of you in your classes have ever had to watch the Hans Rosling video? It's a BBS video for data visualization. That's what it's mainly for. But it's called 200 countries over 200 years in 4 minutes. Anyone? Raise your hand. Right? So what does it start out with?
I don't remember. I just said we watched it.
All right. So do you remember? No. Man, visual aids aren't working. Here. How about there? All right. I very quickly. I don't mean to.
Say it's going to play.
Yes, I know. Well, just like that. So what he's trying to do is he's trying to show you how cool it is that you can plot data. Okay? So he has all these data points, right? And it's like, I forget what it is. I think it's like 100,000 data points or whatever that he's going to have. And what he's going to look at is he divides the world into, over time, poor and sick. And the way he does that is he's looking at life expectancy and per capita income. All right? So poor and sick, or wealthy and healthy. And what he explains is that for most of human history, we were stuck in poor and sick. That's this line here. And then it's only during the Industrial Revolution that you start getting this. And it's first, the Western Europeans, countries, and then it's going to be the Western European offshoots. For example, Canada and the United States do even better than the Western European countries. And they go up like this. And now the big miracle of the 20th century is that more and more countries are actually starting to go up there. India, China, this is the era of globalization. And he's, showing you the whole thing in the data. And it's each time it's being plotted, it keeps on doing this line. But what he does is he recreates, just by a scattergram, this. That's what he recreates. What's this transition from poor and sick to healthy and wealthy? And he points out that this latest run of globalization has actually, in 2015, it is the first time in human history that less than 10% of the world's population was living in extreme poverty. When I was you, 1980s, early 1980s, 40% of the world was living on less than $2 a day. Today, less than 10% of the world is doing that. Why did that happen? The economist's answer is the introduction of globalization and global markets. That's a talk for another day. You can look up Malcolm McLean. He was a North Carolina trucker, and he came up with the idea of containerization, and it was a tremendous idea, and it opened up and lowered the costs. But I'll leave that for your homework. But right now, just do the, right? Do you remember the data visualization now? One of the things I like about it, he was born in 1949, and so he stops at 1949. He says, let's stop here. And he stops and he goes, this was a good year. He goes, Sweden was first at the Winter Olympics, goes through all this stuff. And he goes, and I was born, like that. And then it gets better after that. So, all right, so if modern economic growth is what needs to be explained, poverty is the natural state, wealth is what is required. Matt Ridley has a fantastic thing. He's going to be here. He's an amazing speaker. All right, and he's an amazing mind, and you should push him on this question. But this is the phrase: innovation is the child of freedom and the parent of prosperity. What we have been trying to do ever since Adam Smith is unpack that sentence. What all is entailed in the unpacking of that sentence? What does it mean to be a child of freedom and a parent of prosperity? His book, How Innovation Works, is really, really great book. Well, Adam Smith sort of told us. First thing, peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. Now, that last one, tolerable administration of justice, you could drive a truck through that one. That's huge. What the hell is it? Right? It's a lot, a lot of different questions that can go into that. I'm going to try to offer some of those. But what he really says in the whole chapters on trade and everything is that we engage in productive specialization and realize peaceful social cooperation through trade. How many here have ever heard of the iPencil story? Okay, many of you, right? It's a fantastic story, iPencil. Adam Smith had it first. He called it iWoolen coat, except he didn't call it that. But he tells the story of how a woolen coat ends up on the back of a day laborer. And he walks through the massive amounts of division of labor, specialization and production and exchange that's required to produce even the most homely of products, the common woolen coat on the back of the day laborer. And the number of exchanges and specialization, you just start thinking about, it's just like in the iPencil, right? Where he talks about, having to mine the graphite and, fell the wood and, do all those things like that. That's what he does. He talks about, I'm going to cut the wool off of the sheep. So what do I need? I need shears. Where do I get the shears from? And he goes through all the exchanges that make that possible. That's right in the beginning of The Wealth of Nations. He lays that out. It's really about productive specialization. Can we human beings engage in productive specialization? And through trade, can we realize social cooperation with one another? And in particular, social cooperation among strangers. Right? What's Friedman's line on the iPencil? Right? No one knows how to make a pencil. But a large part of it is no one knows all the different people that are part of making the pencil. The guy who is using the shears doesn't know the miner that helped get the metal to bring it out. But you know what he did know? That it was profitable for that guy to do that activity. It was profitable for this guy to do that activity. It was profitable for this one to do that activity. And they all get together and they cooperate. Engage in mutually beneficial exchange. So productive specialization, social cooperations, institutions, property, contract, and consent. Adam Smith's best friend is one of the greatest heretics in the history of mankind. His name is David Hume. There's a fantastic book. It's called The Infidel and the Professor, about their relationship between one another. They were both the main players of the Scottish Enlightenment. David Hume published a book about 20 years before Smith's Wealth of Nations called A Treatise of Human Nature. And in that, what he does, he's taking on Hobbes. And his argument is that in order for society to get off the ground, we have to have a respect for property, contract, and consent. To put it in deeper ways, the idea that what you're going to do is the security of possessions, the transference of those possessions by consent, and the keeping of promises. Now, as I say it there, it's kind of all abstract, but in your head, solve for the equilibrium the other way. Imagine a world in which possessions are not secure, that we get resources not through transfer by consent, but through conquest, and no one ever keeps their promise. What would that world look like? Right? Not the world that Adam Smith's discussing. It would be a war of all against all. So in order to move away from this world of a war of all against all, we have to respect property, we have to have freedom of contract, and we have to have keeping of promises, honor contracts. Okay? So this is what Smith is trying to build on. This is part of the issue of the connection between the two books. We have to have these moral sensibilities because, now I'm going to put it not in moral language but in economics language. What a moral commitment to security of property or the sanctity of contract, what it does is it lowers the costs of enforcing. Right? All institutions require us to establish what the rule is, formal and informal, and then enforce that institution, formal, informal. One of the great informal enforcement tools is social disapprobation, right? People, talking behind your back, this person is not doing that, they're not a good person. Reputation mechanisms, right? But it's also the case that we rely on formal law, on contract and whatnot to secure property rights. But what Smith is trying to get us to recognize is that there has to be a cultivation of these various different sensibilities, these moral sensibilities, to be able to have that society get off the ground. So this again is in the theory of moral sentiments, right, where he's trying to lay out those ideas. It's not just prudence only. There's all kinds of other values, so it's really valuable to sit there and do it. And then finally, this has to be instantiated in what Smith calls the liberal plan of liberty, equality, and justice. So liberalism caused this. This is the bottom line, right? Here we go. Well, let's see. Can I get it to work? No, why is it not working? It's not picking up okay, it's not picking up on the screen. All right. Anyone here know who Deirdre McCloskey is? Right. So she's a very flamboyant teacher. She's very gregarious when she teaches. And she used to do this following thing. She used to walk across the stage and she would go, wee, and then she would go, whoop, but she would, anyone of a certain age will remember the Fig Newton commercial? She used to do the Fig Newton thing. She'd go, whoop, like that, would lift the leg up like that as she did it. Her argument is really take the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations, smush them together, and then that explains the rise of the bourgeois era. And she's been the major thinker that has tried to really address the underlying morality of the Industrial Revolution, or what she calls the Great Enrichment. So just for you to understand something and let it sink in, by any decent measures of economic output, we are 3,000 times richer than our ancestors. 3,000 times richer. That's unimaginable. All right? Queen Anne, 18 pregnancies. Only one child lived to be past 5. That's the Queen. 18 pregnancies, only one child. Child mortality during this period was horrific. But so was everything else. Just imagine what it was like to live in a home. What was that like? What kind of bed did you have? What was your bed made out of? How well did your roof protect you from the elements? All these kind of things. Like our ancestors, it's a miracle that we're here. Literally a miracle that we're here, okay? And that's all going on here prior to this Industrial Revolution. So what created that? That's our key question. Is it expansion of trade? It's critical, but it doesn't explain the magnitude. Technological innovation. It's real, but it doesn't explain the magnitude. Capital accumulation. Real, but cannot explain the magnitude. Legal institutions. Cannot explain the magnitude. It is ideas that accord dignity and respect to ordinary individuals. That is what triggers this. It's this combustible combination of ideas, institutions, and circumstances that unleash these creative powers of a free civilization. That's what my book is about. You guys have the book in PDF form. You can share it with anyone. Our argument in this book is that the historical path to liberty and human progress is that there's an evolutionary adjacent nature. The fact that those other things don't have the magnitude, they still were necessary, just not sufficient conditions. So the Magna Carta is necessary, but not sufficient. Okay, you have to add all these things up. That's why it reaches a tipping point, and that's why it goes from 0 to 60 like that, right? Because it's not like this, right? That would be a scalar, right? This is a scalar, go like this. This is a non-scalar, all right? So it's not just adding more things in and then we'll get more output out. It's that something different all of a sudden happened. I'm a very proud product of what's called the Virginia School of Political Economy. In fact, I probably bore people by always telling them about the Virginia School of Political Economy and how much of that is. But one of the great economists of the Virginia School of Political Economy is a man named G. Warren Nutter. He wrote the first book challenging Soviet growth accounting. It's called, his dissertation under Milton Friedman, by the way, was on the extent of enterprise monopoly in the United States, where he challenged the standard I.O. Literature at the time. But then he worked on this issue of growth and development. The Soviets were claiming these great growth rates, but the consumer valuations of Soviet people were not getting better, okay? And so how do I explain all of this? Warren Nutter wrote a great book on this, on the extent of industrial development in the USSR. But when he used to pose a question to his students about this hockey stick, he would say the following thing. How does larva become a butterfly? Kids will all look, right? How does larva become a butterfly? Now tell me, can you put that in a solo growth model? Because what a solo growth model gives us is this, not this. But this is what we're trying to explain, not this. But 50 years of economics just worked on this. That's why it had all these problems having to do with convergence and all these other things, which led to this change in the way that we do development economics. My book is trying to address some of those issues. And to go back to the point that I made after pointing out to Russ about the entrepreneurship stuff, is that we argue that it's entrepreneurship in these institutions, so it's unleashing entrepreneurship. That will be the Ridley idea as well. So these rules and markets co-evolve through time. By the way, again, this doesn't point, but notice this board here, that's your answer, by the way, to the how does larva become a butterfly, right? A miracle occurs. I think you should be a little bit more explicit on how that is there, right? This is what we're all trying to do. All right, so for those, anyone South Park fans? All right, this is the big underwear gnomes, right? You know, collect underwear, profits. Collect underwear, profits, right? No one knows how the hell collecting underwear leads to profits, right? Do you remember this? This is one of Cartman's big things. All right, so what do? We have teaching of economics. We have to stress property rights, price theory, and political economy. We have to talk about the institutional foundations in ethics, law, politics, and social mores. We study how alternative institutional arrangements either enable or hinder the pursuit of productive specialization and the realization of peaceful social cooperation through exchange. And this is the punchline, folks. The wealth and poverty of nations depends on getting property rights right. And getting property rights right. All right? You can't just pluck property rights out of thin air. All right? They have to fit with the historical, conditions and acceptance at the time. It's what me and some of my co-authors call stickiness of the institutions, but you have to focus on those property rights that get property rights right. All right, so back to Adam Smith. The thing to be explained was social cooperation among disparate and distant people. That's his explanandum. The explanandum of economics is social cooperation. The explains is rational choice institutionalism. Right? So the thing to be explained is social cooperation. The way we try to explain it is through rational choice institutionalism. What is rational choice institutionalism? We do rational choice theory as if the choosers are humans. right? So we have a very thin notion of rationality rather than a thick, cognitively driven notion of rationality. People are striving to do the best that they can given their situation. They can make errors of estimations, they can make errors of execution, but they're still striving to do the best that they can given the situation. Easy way to put this is if I want to exit this room, eventually I'll find the exit sign. I might on first think, I don't know, that I'm like the invisible man or something. I could try to walk through here, like I have X-Man possibilities or whatever. And so I try to walk through there. I can't walk through there. I can't walk through there, but I want to get the hell out of the room. So eventually, what am I going to do? There. It doesn't mean that I'm going to go there right off the first bat. What it means is that I'm not persistently stupid, which is different from saying I'm always correct. That's all economics needs, because it's going to explain the tendency and direction of human behavior, striving to do the best that they can given their circumstances. Individuals are going to do that. But what defines those circumstances? Those circumstances are defined by the institutional ecosystem within which they operate. And that institutional ecosystem isn't given to them from on top, it's actually bubbles up from the bottom. So we do rational choice theory as if the choosers are human, and we do institutional analysis as if history matters. And so that's why explaining the evolutionary adjacent moves in the long path towards getting liberty is made up of all these little moves along the way, right? You can go through all of them like that. How many of the older crowd here remember Star Trek, the Captain Kirk one? You know, with William Shatner, who just celebrated his birthday yesterday or whatever. One of my favorite Captain Kirk ones, and you guys all have access to it because there's a thing called YouTube if you haven't figured it out. And you can just look this up. There's an episode where Kirk is being accused of killing the lieutenant that he stepped over. The guy's name was Finney, okay? Now, the whole thing goes on. The computer is saying that Kirk did it. Computer's saying Kirk did it. Now, they play a little fast one. Spock goes to play chess with the computer, all right, and beats the computer in chess. So Spock knows something's wrong with the computer because there's a little thing in game theory, right, which says that two rational agents should never be able to beat each other. It's called Ullmann's theorem, right? They're invoking it. It's people that write the story, very good. So Spock, who's perfectly rational, should not be able to beat the chess. They should just have a draw. Should never be able to do it. So he comes back and says, something's wrong with the computer because I can beat the computer in chess. Someone must have messed around with it, right? So then they find it out. But what's interesting is the lawyer that takes over, after Spock tells him this. And he says, finally, we can now face our accuser, which is a fundamental right of human beings to be able to face their accuser. He says, and from the Magna Carta to the basically goes through the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution of the United States to the compound of Martian colonies, because again it's in the future or whatever. But this is the kind of, I know I'm totally weird now, but this was the kind of thing I'm trying to say is that these little moves that were made back here, like being able to actually have the revolution break out in 1620 made possible the resolution of that revolution in 1688. Right? So the constitutional crisis, you guys talk about that here because it has to do with King Charles. Right? Off with your head. Right? All these things. Those little moves along the way all had that play in, and they play their different part. That's what we mean by doing history, doing institutions as if history mattered. All right? So getting the prices right is a key aspect of that. All right, so specialization in exchange leads to these refinements in the division of labor, the expansion of trade. Okay, and let me just say to the students here, one of the things that's really, really vital in our understanding of economic development is that economic development requires that you are able to produce more with less. Economic poverty results when you end up by producing less with more. So one of the key issues is how do you sort from what you might think is a desirable outcome to then a technologically feasible outcome to then an economically viable outcome. The economically viable outcome is the one that you produce more with less. Technologically feasible one, there's lots of technologically feasible ones to do certain things, but some of them are prohibitively expensive. All right, so when I first started teaching economics, I was a graduate student at the time. George Mason University had this massive expansion of population, but not the infrastructure for it. So there was a huge parking problem on campus. So maybe some of you might already anticipate where I went with things. I was trying to get students, what I wanted them to do was I was going to have them price. So the parking spots that were close by, high price, parking spots that were way back, low price, and then we're going to solve the parking problem, right, at George Mason. So I put this to my students. Now what's fascinating is none of my students did like the Star Trek thing and just say, well, we can beam me up, Scotty, that's how I can get to class. But also none of them used the price system to fix the problem. So I was a failed professor. But here's what they did. They did these things. Now note how they're all technologically feasible. They said, we should mandate that only two-wheeled vehicles are allowed on campus, and then we could double up the parking spots. So 4 wheels, now we're going to have only 2 wheels. All right? Another one, which was my favorite, which was George Mason is just up on Braddock Road away from a major hub that goes around Washington, D.C. called 495. And they said, why don't we put a helicopter pad on the top of the office building on 495, because that's a major community thing. People can go there, get in the helicopter, and the helicopter can go to the student union, land there, and then we could just go back and forth all day long. All right, now note, those are all technologically feasible. But even you are laughing, because why? You know that's astronomically expensive. So what happens in an economic system that's functioning is all the technologically feasible projects are squeezed down to those that are economically efficient. They're viable. They produce more with less. So one of the key things about markets is that they communicate the preferences of their participants, but they do it in a way that producers are going to provide the least cost method to generate or match that preference that is being satisfied by the goods in the market. Okay. Division of labor's expansion of the trade. This is the reason why the globalization. Violence, trap, and lack of development. All right, last slide. Promise. Okay. Why should you read Adam Smith today? You. Let's see, do I have any tents with names? No, I don't have any names. Why should you read Adam Smith? 1, wisdom. There's great wisdom in Adam Smith, right? Wisdom about moral and political philosophy. There's deep insight in Adam Smith about why some nations are rich and other nations are poor. All right? And there's great guidance, which is what he calls our great purpose. What does it mean for us to live in peace and prosperity with one another? So here's the one big puzzle. There is many different ways for people to live. There's very few ways for people to live peacefully and prosperously. There's not only one way for them to live peacefully and prosperously, but there's a lot smaller number than the number of ways in which we live. And Smith helps us narrow down that set by asking us to think about the moral characteristic of a free society and the institutions of a free society and the economics that follows from unleashing the creative powers of a free people. You'll hear more about that, from Matt Ridley talking about that. Like I said, innovation is the child of freedom and the parent of prosperity. But that's like what I would argue. So you have the wisdom, the insight, and the guidance from a thinker from the 18th century that still speaks to us today in the 21st century. And that's pretty amazing. So I hope you get a chance to wrestle with Smith and work through them. And again, thank you to everyone here for having this week and for having me be part of it. So thank you.
So we have a few minutes for questions. We have a...
You have a practice to start scholars.
We have a norm here, which is that we let our market process scholars get the opportunity to ask the first question. So, who wants to, okay.
I'm still trying to develop my question, but you were talking about this hockey stick and all the factors that went into that preceded that, which allowed for that spontaneous order and that invisible hand to work through all of those mechanisms, resulted in that mass uptake in prosperity.
Yeah.
I guess when you apply it to the United States now, I know you were talking about how there's kind of a resurgence of mercantilism and these zero-sum thoughts. Do you think that it's going to take a little bit longer? I guess I don't want to say worse, like things to get worse in order for people to see Adam Smith's thoughts and views as something that should be instilled again, or I guess like kind of what precedes the factors that allow for that.
Yeah.
Hypothesis?
So it's a really great question that you're.
Can you really repeat the question, Pete, in the shorter form?
Yeah. So she's asking the question of, if the world is going in a very mercantilist direction today, how is it that you would ever have the reversal to get Adam Smith's insights again? Or is it going to continue to get worse before it can get better? Is that a good? Yeah. And I think this is a really great question, and it's one that is on the minds of all of us, because one of the things that we've seen in the last decade is what's called, not only on economics, but in politics, called democratic backsliding. If you look at, since the end of World War II and the rise of post-colonialism, we have seen nothing but increases in democratic freedom throughout the world. And now what we're doing is seeing tick downs go the other way. Populist authoritarians on the left and on the right. So it's not just right-wing authoritarians, it's also left-wing authoritarians are all over the place, right? And so that's a tick down, tick the opposite way. That figure that I told you about, that less than 10% of the world's population was living in extreme poverty, that took a little bit of a hit during COVID, by the way, so they kind of clipped back up over, but now it's kind of come back again. But that also is going to be a major problem with all of this as we close down borders for goods and services, as well as for people. Because one of the things that drives economic growth throughout the world is the fluidity of capital and labor to move where it has its highest rates of return. And so we want to welcome that and encourage that, because I think, again, that allows us to produce more with less rather than less with more. And the world has sort of moved. There's a large number of people who are moving to close the world rather than open it. For a variety of reasons, some of which are more understandable, but I will say the following thing to everyone here, because I would go on record with this. Most of the problems that we see throughout Europe with immigration problems, especially, say Syrian refugees, is the fact that the European economies do not allow the integration into European labor markets. Right? So I migrate and I'm not allowed to actually have a job, all these kind of things like that. So it's not like, it's just this cultural story. A culture that believes in X comes to a culture that believes in Y, and they have a culture clash. It's literally the culture Y doesn't allow the culture X to integrate into the economy. Ben Powell has written a lot on this issue, and so he would be a great resource to look at. But I think that the work for us economists is cut out more than probably any time in my career as an economist since 1989. Even more than 2008. 2008 was a heady time for economists as well. But I think that this particular one is quite, in both cases, 2008 and now, it's quite interesting because its economics ideas are a consequence of a great forgetting. So we had already dealt with what the problems were with Keynesian economics from the 1970s all the way. So somehow the idea that in 2008 we were going to see the return of the master to be able to solve things was a great forgetting of what we had learned in the period that led from 1950 to 1970. And I think similarly, what this new protectionism kind of idea is a great forgetting about the benefits of globalization and the arguments for free trade. So I understand Doug Irwin was here last year. He's the best source to read on this. This reversal of the negative, the zero-sumness that has to be really addressed, and it's a deep question in our education system. And we could talk about it after for a short bit, but it can't be solved with a very simple answer right now. But great question. It's one that keeps us up at night all the time.
Thank you. I have lots of questions, but one of them is, why do we continue to see people reasoning from accounting identities? We see this with the modern monetary theory crowd. We see this with the president when it comes to the trade deficit. Also, how much of this is a marketing problem? If we had called it the capital surplus to begin with, would the president actually embrace it? So yeah, what is it about people reasoning from accounting identities? Is it what measures gets improved? Do we, is GDP the right thing to measure, or are we just failing to measure what real economic prosperity looks like?
Well, how many questions are in that one? You and Brian, I think, will be much better at answering the question about the accounting identities and the intellectual error that's involved in what is currently passing for both fiscal and monetary policy. I'm teaching PhD level macro. All right, at some level, there's an absurdity of this. But what happened was we had a very, very famous professor of macro who decided to retire. And it's either a combination of my colleagues having great faith in me or my colleagues being lazy as hell. But they drafted me to teach a course. Remember that Homo Professor Nomicus line, right? Anyway, so they drafted me to take over the PhD macro. So at first, I'm like, okay, I'm going to teach it like normal people or whatever. And then I'm like, screw that. They put me in this job, let them kick me out. So I'm teaching the whole class as if Keynes never existed. It's like microeconomics. That's another microeconomics, because before Keynes, there was no macroeconomics. There's just microeconomics. It's just, like this. And so again, why is it, what's going on with, employment policy? Well, it's marginal productivity, theory of wages, right? This is the kind of thing that I'm doing in the class. And so a lot of these macro identities, I think, are just intellectual errors. And I think the empirical consequences of that are huge, and they're laid out by Robert Higgs. So Robert Higgs, I started my class by having them read these series of papers by Bob Higgs. They're in the Journal of Economic History, and they're about the growth accounting during World War II. And he looks at the issue about, did the military spending get us out of the Great Depression? His argument is no, it didn't. Once you take into account the right, accounting. Was there going to be a great stagnation, which, by the way, was the prediction of all the military Keynesians? There wasn't. Why? Because regime uncertainty was reduced. Consumers started going into the market. Firms responded. And so, to me, I think that we would be much better off as economists, and of course I'm an outlier in this, if that we didn't have courses called macro. And instead, what we had was courses called money and banking. And we had classes that were a price theoretic and then labor economics and, fiscal policy, right? And whatnot. Public economics, maybe, not macroeconomics, right? But again, so I was the director of graduate studies at George Mason University many, many years ago, and I proposed this at the time. And Charles Rowley was a faculty member at the time. I don't know if I ever told you this story, but Charles Rowley is the one who shot down the proposal because he said none of the George Mason students would be able to get a job at the University of Pennsylvania if they didn't have macroeconomics. And I'm like, when was the last student that got a job at University of Pennsylvania? What are you talking about? Of course, they're not going to hire you there, but they might hire you somewhere else. But yeah, anyway, I lost on that. So now I'm getting my revenge back by teaching this course the way I'm teaching, which is all price theory. MMT, I think is just an intellectual error. A lot of the growth accounting is just an intellectual error. And we need, and the thing is that Kuznets, who was the inventor of national income accounts, knew it was an error. And he told them not to use it for economic policy purposes. Right? He told them not to use it for economic. But once you have a tool, this is a bigger question about the nature of economics, which is different from Adam Smith. If I had infinite time with all of you, I would read 2 paragraphs from the theory of moral sentiments. So you can maybe do this for a homework assignment. which is look up the paragraph that says the man of systems. Right? That's a famous passage of his. But look at the paragraph right above it. And the paragraph above it is the man of public interest. What the man of public interest does, what the man of systems does. And that really does juxtapose the position that one would see 200 years later between Hayek and Keynes. So difference, if you read Hayek's Nobel Prize address, he says we must cease acting as if the economy is something that we can control. All right? And instead of being engineers, we have to fashion ourselves as gardeners that cultivate the economic activity, not direct the economic activity. All right? Versus the man of systems who attempts that they can move the pieces on the chessboard wherever they may want them to. So, to go back to this, in Adam Smith's Butcher, Baker, and Brewer, the dinner is already there on your table. You didn't need an economist to orchestrate the dinner. In fact, if economists left, the dinner would still be there. Just people wouldn't be able to reflect on the philosophical reasons why it had. But like I just gave a lecture last week on the 1946 Full Employment Act. And in the 1946 Full Employment Act, unless the government is there and the economists are guiding the government, you can't get full employment. It's the economist who orchestrates full employment, not the labor market. The economist who orchestrates it. And that's why they use the deficit as a policy, because they're the orchestrators. This is Lerner's steering wheel. Without the steering wheel, you can't get the wheel to actually think. So that's a different approach to look at these things. So Adam Smith was practicing the way we put this nowadays is he practiced economics from the inside out, not from the outside in. What that means is that you put priority on the cleverness, creativity, and resourcefulness of the people who populate your society you're studying, not the studier. We get rewarded in our profession by being clever and creative and resourceful theorists. But the economy doesn't require us. We could disappear and the common woolen coat would still happen. The dinner would be on your table. The iPhone would be in your pocket. BlackBerry would have been weeded out. You don't need an economist to explain that story. For that story to happen, you need economists to come in and explain what's the consequences of that story. And so I think that's, but I'll leave the correcting of this is a 1-2 punch you got over here. So I'll leave the correcting of fiscal affairs to Romina, and I'll leave Brian to fix MMT. And I just stand back and say, read Adam Smith.